And our next presenter is Rebecca Yamin. Rebecca holds a PhD in anthropology from NYU and spent 20 years as a principal archaeologist with John Milner Associates Incorporated in Philadelphia. Her first major project with the firm was the analysis, interpretation, and preparation of a 6-volume report for the Five Points site in New York City, a report I know that I've consulted quite a lot. And I believe there are over 1 million artifacts if we're comparing these quantitative stats of numbers of artifacts processed from that site. During the restoration of Independence Mall in Philadelphia, she directed large excavations on the site of the Independence Visitor Center and the Liberty Bell Center. More recent Philadelphia projects include the Convention Center Extension and the Museum of the American Revolution sites. She is author of Digging in the City of Brotherly Love, Stories from Philadelphia Archaeology, and Archaeology at the Site of the Museum of the American Revolution, A Tale of Two Taverns and the Growth of Philadelphia. She also edited a special issue of the journal Historical Archaeology devoted to the Five Points Project and wrote the book Rediscovering Raritan Landing, an adventure in New Jersey archaeology that interprets 20 years of work at an 18th and 19th century port site in New Jersey. So I welcome Rebecca to the podium.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be included in this wonderful symposium. Okay, glasses. Okay. I like to start with the stuff. These 2 chamber pots were found in a backyard barrow privy on the site of the Convention Center expansion in Philadelphia. John Milner Associates did the investigation in 2007. The lot with the chamber pots was one of the least disturbed on the site. It was sandwiched, here's a good urban picture for you, between standing structures on Race Street, once called sassafras. The barrow privies, there were 3, apparently went with a frame house that faced an alley at the back of the lot. The 2-story frame house predated a later brick structure on sassafras, and the brick foundation wall for the rear L of that later building, you can see that on the right of the slide, partially covered the barrow privy that produced the chamber pots. The TPQ for the artifacts found in all of the barrow privies was 1850. Josiah Eddy, an African-American, lived in a rented room in the frame house on the alley from 1838 to 1852. When he arrived in the city, he was apparently single. He was a barber, and he probably settled in this part of the city, which was not an African-American neighborhood, for business reasons. His brother Joshua, who had preceded him to the city, was also a barber, and perhaps Joshua wanted to expand his clientele with his younger brother's help. It's also true that Broad Street, on the western edge of the block where Josiah lived, was becoming a busy commercial thoroughfare, which might have produced lunchtime customers. The African American Census, an amazing document, of 1838 shows a woman named Mary Miller who did day work and her 2 children living in a shed addition to the back of the house Josiah rented. But the 1840 census does not show any other Black families on the block, although there were 7 individuals living in white households. By the time of the 1847 African American census, Eddy was married. His family included a wife named Louisa, 2 daughters under 15, and an older woman who had been enslaved. Both adults under 50 were employed, Josiah still as a barber and his wife as a washer, a very common occupation for African American women in this period in Philadelphia. The family paid $5 a month in rent. 2 members of the household could read and write. They all attended church. 2 of them belonged to Benevolent Societies, and 1 of the girls went to the Adelphia School. All this information comes from the 1847 census, which was made by a committee of Quakers. And, I mean, it's an amazing document. There are 42 fields of information. You know, how many people in the household, what they paid for rent, who went to school, where they went to. I mean, an amazingly rich document. Only one of the other household near the Eddys appeared to be headed by an African-American woman. So why would the Eddy family own 2 chamber pots, there they are again, that appear to be decorated with American eagles. As I have speculated elsewhere, the chamber pots may have had something to do with the Eddies' involvement with with Bethel African Methodist Episcopal AME Church, the church founded by Richard Allen in 1794. Josiah's brother Joshua was an ordained minister in the church. Interestingly, he was also married to Richard Allen's daughter. Josiah and his family belonged to the church, even though it was on the other side of town from where they were living, and eventually Josiah also became a minister and deacon of Bethel AME. Even after his death, Richard Allen's philosophy permeated church practice. He was an ardent abolitionist who envisioned Methodism as an evangelical religion, quote, that promised equality to all believers. In his biography of Allen, Richard Newman claims, in quote, in Allen's eyes, Black Christians would be the prophets of a new American morality, promising not just spiritual liberty, but universal freedom, unquote. Allen eulogized George Washington and also cleaned his chimney. He emphasized the fact that in his will, Washington manumitted his slaves, albeit not until after the death of his wife. Allen believed the Declaration of Independence was a covenant binding Americans of all races, classes, and religions into a nation of equal citizens. His preaching did not discriminate between religious and patriotic subjects or symbols. It was all part of the same struggle. Clearly, images of the American eagle, a symbol that was adopted as an emblem of the United States in 1784, would not have been objectionable to Allen, no matter how profane their use. The Eddies also left a ceramic sherd with the image of Lafayette on it, lower left, in one of the privies, another patriotic choice that may have reflected their devotion to church principles as much as anything else. Josiah Eddy and his family left those chamber pots behind when they moved to 6 Russell Street in 1852, and soon after to Lombard Street, just a few blocks from Bethel AME. Unlike Sassafras, Russell Street was in the heart of the African-American neighborhood surrounding Bethel Church. Ongoing research by Philadelphia historian Terry Buckalow is revealing the neighborhood in graphic detail, and with his permission, I thought it would be useful to present some of the results here. While pursuing research relating to Octavius Catto, the famous educator, civil rights activist, and his partner Carol and Rebecca LeConte, also an educator and activist, Terry ran across a reference to Bethel burying ground, which he knew nothing about. He began to hunt for the burial records, which were not in the church archives. In fact, most of the church records disappeared in about 1850. With incredible diligence and ingenuity, he has been able to find the records dispersed in the city archives. I cannot tell you what a labor-intensive thing this is, that this man is doing on his own. And he's used them in combination with the African-American census to build a picture of what life was like for this free African-American community in the 19th century. I'm only considering those records generally dating to the period when the Eddies moved to the neighborhood. People lived in a variety of abysmal conditions, most of them on narrow alleys within the general vicinity of Bethel AME Church. This map shows some of the alleys highlighted. St. Mary's Alley, labeled street here, for instance, is described in secondary sources as a narrow thoroughfare lined with dilapidated hovels. Mary Smart, whose 2-year-old baby died in 1851, lived on the alley in a room or part of a room for which she would have paid 25 to 75 cents a week. Her husband, a laborer, had died of cholera at 35, 1.5 years earlier. Moses and Elizabeth Macklin owned their house on Harmony Court, very close to the church, just above the church. Mr. Macklin was a wood sawyer. Mrs. Macklin took in washing and ironing, and there were 2 adult children in the household. 2 women in their 60s, both laundresses, plus 2 younger women, also laundresses, and a man who worked as a waiter, lived at number 11 Emmeline Street, unfortunately off the map to the left. Emmeline was another narrow alley crowded beyond its limits with 46 African-American families, including 171 men, women, and children. Some did relatively well, working for white families and the businesses they patronized. There were carpenters, coachmen, private waiters, barbers, dressmakers, seamstresses, and ladies' maids. A family living on Emmeline that lost a 2-year-old baby in 1848 was apparently among the better off, paying $5.75 in monthly rent for what may have been more than one room. Others on the street, half according to the census taker, lived in shelters in the rear of houses that faced the street. Small Street, the bottom one that's highlighted, was the site of one of the worst racial riots in the city's history at the Flying Horses in 1834. But Reverend Joseph Corr, a celebrated minister and class leader in Bethel AME's history, lived there with his wife in the 1830s. Small Street residents also had been blamed for the cholera epidemic of 1832, and the street continued to be known as the Devil's Den up to the 1850s. Some living situations were better. A Mrs. Fletcher headed a household at 8.5 Barley Alley between 10th and 11th Streets that included 4 adult women, 2 working as seamstress dressmakers, and 2 as domestics. Mrs. Fletcher owned the house, for which she paid $4 a month on the mortgage. Also in this area were the LeContes, Bolivar's, Proctors, and Durhams, known as keystones in the building of the educational, cultural, business, and religious and civil rights institutions. This woman also lived there. They lived in relative comfort on Rodman Street between 10th and 11th, but others lived in even worse conditions. 2 washwomen in a converted horse stall with dirt floors, number 3 Gray's Alley. A seaman and a washwoman in a 13 by 13 foot room at number 45 Quince Street. A domestic washwoman and child in a 1-room shed near the noisy southern entrance to the city. A widow living with a family, including 2 children and their parents. A washwoman and a waterman in a 12 by 12 foot room at number 30 Raspberry Street, and a family of 6 in a 9 by 9 foot room on Lombard. Many things are striking in these records, and I'm only partway through them. One is how many people lived in single rooms, but also how everyone worked for wages, men, women, and teenage children. Your young children went to school, and adults went to church and belonged to benevolent societies. Benevolent societies, says historian Gary Nash, were how the Black community took care of itself. Closed out of city institutions because of white prejudice, African Americans founded their own organizations. The first, the Free African Society, established in 1786. By 1831, there were 44 Black benevolent societies, and by the 1850s, there were presumably even more. Bacalau's portraits of these families begin with the death record of one family member. That's the unfortunate conditions. The average age of death for men was 42.9, for women it was 42.3. They died of cholera, typhus, consumption, heart disease, pleurisy, and many of tuberculosis. Children died of TB too, and also of stomach ailments and even starvation. All were buried at Bethel Burial Ground, which brings me back to archaeology. Richard Allen purchased land for a burying ground between Catherine and Queen Street in the area now known as Queen Village. The burial ground lies between 4th and 5th Street on the city's grid. In 1826, the Union Benevolent Sons of the Mother Bethel established a society to aid in the expenses of funerals. By 1869, the quarter-acre plot was filled to capacity, and the land was rented to a sugar refiner to be used for the storage of wagons. It was presumably then that the stones were removed. When the city bought the property in 1889, it was described as a rubbish-strewn hard clay lot used as a trash dump and place for neighborhood children to play. The city expanded the area beyond the edges of the burying ground. It became a school garden minded by 6th and 7th graders between 1904 and 1905, and formally became the Wekako Playground in 1906. In 2013, the city proposed renovations to the playground, which triggered an archaeological study. AECOM did the work. Once research and preliminary testing established that the burials had never been moved and potentially lay undisturbed beneath the southwest corner of the playground, 4 trenches were used to determine the depths and conditions of the grave. All the work was done in public. That's Doug Mooney of AECOM talking to the public view, and well and was well reported in the newspapers. AECOM archaeologists determined that the shallowest grave shafts began at about 1.8 feet below the present ground surface, with intact burial remains between 2.5 and 3 feet below the surface. There are at least 2 layers of burials, but possibly 3, and the total number of graves may be as high as 5,000. They will not be disturbed by playground renovations. The site has been listed on the National Register. A plaque describing the historic burial ground was installed in December of 2019, happily, and that's the mayor in the middle. And the community building that covers a portion of the original burying ground will be removed. Buckalow's research on the people who lie beneath the ground, begun before the need for archaeology arose, is a tribute to the otherwise anonymous Bethel congregates. Neither Joshua nor Josiah Eddy is buried in Bethel Church burying ground. They died too late, Joshua in 1882 and Josiah in 1897, both of old age. I cannot be sure that the chamber pots, there they are again, with the American Eagle decorations had anything to do with Bethel AME, although they led me to the church and its founders' politics. The eagles may indeed have been interpreted as something else. An African-American woman who heard me lecture suggested that the birds could represent the Sankofa, an Akan symbol that is interpreted, at least in the present, as meaning go back and fetch it, return to your past, and it is not taboo to go back and retrieve what you have forgotten and lost. I like that idea, but I've not been able to find any indication that the Sankofa was known or referred to in 19th century Philadelphia. There were benevolent societies with African names, though, and Bishop Daniel Alexander Payne, a strict assimilationist, scolded Bethel members for after-church African-style dancing and singing. I also don't know why Josiah lived in a white working-class neighborhood when he first came to Philadelphia. Maybe it was for the barbering business, but another colleague has suggested he was having an affair with a single woman who lived with her children in the back of his house. The couple would have needed to avoid the prying eyes of Bethel church members who wouldn't have approved. According to Terry Buckalew, the few Bethel records that exist are full of condemnations of this kind of thing. What I absolutely do know is that both Joshua and Josiah Eddy were deeply involved in Bethel AME church minister, as ministers and teachers. Joshua may have preached, but what Josiah probably did was prepare people for church membership, is what the lay clergy did. What I've tried to do here is suggest the community in which the Eddys lived and to which they devoted their talents. Thank you. I now get to introduce the terrific organizer of this symposium, Meredith Lynn. She is an assistant professor of historical archaeology at Bard Graduate Center. She earned her PhD in anthropology from Columbia University. Her research interests include community formation, race, immigration, experiences and perceptions of illness and injury, and popular healing practices. Her work is focused on 19th century New York City, particularly upon Irish immigrants in Lower Manhattan. She used 5 points data, which is wonderful. I really appreciate that. And upon Seneca Village, the predominantly African-American community whose land was taken by the city to construct Central Park. She was part of the team that excavated Seneca Village in 2011 and is a co-author with Nan Rothschild and Diana Wall of the Archaeological Site Report. Meredith has also written several articles about the health-related experiences and strategies of Irish immigrants, and she is working on a book that, I'm glad to hear that expands this research. Meredith.